Samaria, and how John used her as the antithesis of Nicodemus in chapter 3. Mentioned that everything that he was, she was not. So where she was, or Nicodemus was educated and respected and a Jew and a teacher of Israel, she was uneducated, a Samaritan outcast, even from her own Samaritan community. And so there was this great contrast in them. But what John is trying to show, or what John is showing, I always hate when I say that phrase, trying to show. He is showing it. Whether I'm picking it up or not, he's still showing it. But what John is showing is that both of these people from opposite ends of the spectrum need what? They need Jesus. They need salvation because they're human beings. And I think John at the end of chapter 4 kind of goes into the same thing with the noblemen. Who else needs Jesus? And the idea or the answer is royalty. Royalty needs Jesus. We'll look at that in just a moment as we ask the question, who is this nobleman? But that's kind of the answer that he gets to. And so John records this second miracle done by Jesus in the city of Cana of Galilee. Now that's important. John does not intend to say here that this is Jesus' second miracle, but that this is Jesus' second miracle in Cana. Now the first miracle in Cana, John labels as Jesus' first miracle at all. But here it is only the second in Cana of Galilee. So we need not get confused on that in verse 54 when he says it's the second sign which Jesus did in this city. So here I think John is bringing up the sign and even calling it the second sign of Cana in order to connect this account all the way back with the first account in chapter 2. This is John giving us a picture of what is happening during Jesus' ministry. And even though he does not necessarily seek to give us a chronological account, every once in a while, he does speak of time. For example, in chapter 1, he says this was the second day, and this was the third day, and this was the fourth day, and then 3 days later. And what he's done in those verses is given us the first week of Jesus' ministry, which is quite amazing. But then a lot of these stories are, they're taken, John is looking back, remember, some nearly 60 years after the events that take place. And, imagine yourself, let's just say, at the age of 75, doing memoirs and writing down, your memoirs. Will every story happen in exact chronological order? I mean, I'm not 75, and if you started asking me about my childhood and I started telling you stories, they would all be true, but I couldn't tell you, which Christmas I got what, but I can remember a lot of the big gifts. I can remember when I got a train set. I can remember when I got my first mini bike and when I got my second mini bike because I wrecked the first one. And when I got my third mini bike, I really think we got the extras because there were two boys, my brother and myself. So, we needed two. And then when one broke down, we had a third in order, backup, so we'd both be able to ride. But we didn't get them all on the same Christmas, though. We got them at different times. Which came first? Probably hard-pressed to tell you which one it was, but I can tell you that all of those stories are true. And that's kind of the way John is doing. He's putting together the stories of Jesus in order to bring about faith, right? Many other signs, therefore, did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe. You may have life in believing. And that concept of believing is throughout John. In fact, whenever it says in chapter 2 and verse 11 that this was the first miracle, it said that many believed, right? And when the man comes tonight, we'll get into that in just a minute, but the idea of belief, remember, keep that first and foremost. When we talk about these face-to-face encounters with Jesus, the ultimate goal in every one of them is to provoke faith in those that he's talking to or those that he's engaging. So let's look at this nobleman. In chapter 4, John chapter 4, beginning in verse 46, it says, "So Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water to wine. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill." The ESV says official. The Greek word there is basilikos, which is, you hear, for example, St. Peter's Basilica is a religious site somewhere in Europe. I don't even know where, but you hear basilica. I believe it's in Rome, but I'm not positive. Any idea what that is? A basilica. That's just a transliteration, by the way, from the Greek word. And it's the same Greek word that's used here. It's kingdom. This is the word that is translated kingdom or king. It's the same root word. It's not kingdom here, but it's the same root word. And it carries the idea of kingly or royal, what we would say royalty. Now, there's a question about what it means by that. If you were talking about the king's son or his daughter or anyone of his family, you would use this word to describe that person. If you're talking about the king's guard, the military people that were immediately around him, then you would use this word. In other words, these are the king's guards. These are the king's families. If you were talking about someone that was in the employ of the king, as, say, maybe a tax collector or one who was a herald to the community, you would use this word. It had a lot of purposes, this particular word. And what we are missing, though, is, we might say a king's son or the king's guard or the king's official. But what we're missing is that second word, son, official, or guard. It just says there was a man in Capernaum that was the king's. It was kingly. A lot of translations translate this then as the nobleman, that he was probably someone of the king's household and therefore a nobleman. Could have been a prince, could have been a nephew, not necessarily one in line to be the king, but still part of the king's family. And that's certainly possible, and I think most likely. Some have suggested that it's a reference to the king's guard, and I think this is because of a conflation between this account and the centurion of Matthew chapter 8, Luke chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5, and going down through about verse 13, there is the account of a centurion who comes to Jesus in Capernaum. And he says that his servant is dying. And Jesus said, well, let's go heal him. And the man says, no, I'm like you, a man of authority. When I say to one, go, he goes. And when I say to another, come, he comes. Don't come to my house. He even tells Jesus, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. If you will just say the word, then my servant will be healed. And you remember Jesus marveled at such great a faith, right? And a lot of people say, well, this story in John is the same account that Matthew is describing in Matthew chapter 8. Because look, there's a lot of similarities. Capernaum is one of the cities that's mentioned in both accounts. Certainly one that has authority, either a nobleman or the centurion. They're higher up officials. And the kings could be a king's guard and a centurion, and that's where that comes in. Then, of course, there's a great distance is covered by the healing itself. And so, look here, this is just John getting some details wrong. But that's not true. It's simply another account. Look, if we want to get technical, every account of a miracle which Jesus performs has a lot of similarities, right? A man comes to Jesus who's blind. Another man comes to Jesus who's deaf. Well, look there. There's a similarity. They're both men. And because they're both men, this must be the same one. They just got the detail of blindness and deafness wrong, right? No, there's going to always be some similarities. The fact that Capernaum comes in to play, that's hardly unusual since Jesus' headquarters is in Capernaum. It was one of the principal cities of Galilee itself, and so that doesn't really cause us any issue or problem. But what's more significant to me are the differences. You know, for the centurion, it was a servant. For the nobleman, it's a son. For the centurion, he comes to Jesus in Capernaum. But for the nobleman, he leaves Capernaum and comes to Jesus in Cana. And so there's a lot of differences here. The centurion says, I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. But the nobleman is begging Jesus, come down to my house. That is a major difference. The faith that they start off with is different. So they're not simply a conflated idea here. So I don't think that there's much weight given to that this is the king's guard. Although technically it could be used that way. I just don't think that it's there. That leaves kind of the third option, which is a king's, not a servant, but one in his employee, like the IRS agent or something like that. And so that's why the ESV translates it official. I think more likely it is the first one, because I think if you're going to use that concept of the kings or kingly without a particular referent, that you would immediately think of the king's family, no matter how extended that might be. So it could be a nephew, could be a cousin, could be some relation to the king, but not in line to the throne. And therefore wouldn't have been referred to as a prince or something like that. Frank, do you have a question? Could be. Because John is not written chronologically, we don't know exactly where this story goes into place or in the timeline. So it's hard to really place it. But certainly, this is Galilee. This is a region where the name of Jesus is famous. In fact, you remember if we take Mark chapters 1 through 7 take place in Galilee. It's nearly a Galilean ministry with only a couple of exceptions does Mark, even though we know that Jesus left Galilee during that time, Mark is focusing on how impactful Jesus' early ministry was in Galilee. So these would certainly be part of that. And so maybe that is why the centurion, based upon all the things that he's heard, and maybe this was one of those stories that he heard. And of course, being from Capernaum, would have heard a lot about Jesus during that time. But it would be difficult to say with assurance one way or the other. But I think it's likely that Jesus heard these stories, or that the centurion heard these stories. I was confident of them. Jennifer? Mm-hmm.
Or in Galilee.
No, in Cana of Galilee.
Okay, yeah. The other thing I was thinking of is that so many people limit Jesus to what is written in the Bible. And as you said earlier, John wrote, there's so many more that have been written that the whole world wouldn't be able to contain the books of everything that he did. And so they try to compare one miracle against another and limit that.
Yeah.
You have no idea.
How many women did he heal of blindness or men of deafness? Or, it's just, they're not all recorded for us. None of the biographers intend to record every step and every detail because, as John says, the world couldn't contain the whole. Try to write every detail of your life. Ira Rice, great missionary to Singapore for many years and a valiant soldier for the truth, started on his autobiography and had intended to do 3 volumes. Passed away before he completed them, but 3 volumes in his life, and he didn't do the miracles. He didn't, he didn't have quite the impact that Jesus had. And I have his first one, which is thicker than my Bible. And, it doesn't contain the history of the world, including, the life of Jesus. It's they're giving us what we need. And I think part of that goes right into the law of parsimony, which is a principle that we ascribe to God, that God does not do unnecessary things. He's not just willy-nilly doing everything. What man can do, he commands man to do it. God does not waste words. God does not waste time. And God does not need, he gives us exactly what we need to come in faith and trust of him so that we might be saved. That's what he's given us. From Genesis to Revelation, it's exactly what we need. And people can lament that all they want, but this is it. So here's this nobleman, kingly. Who's the king? Anyone know who the king is at this time? It's Herod, part of the Tetrarch, that's right. So this would be the Herod that's in control of the northern parts of Palestine and Syria. And this would be Herod Antipas. His palace was at Tiberias, which is a few miles away from Capernaum, right on the coast of the Sea of Galilee itself. And so this may have been a part of that royal family. Like I said, maybe a cousin or something like that. What else do we know about this nobleman? There's not a lot here, but I think there's something very significant in the text. Well, that's something about him, but about who he is, or his identity, actually. He was at Capernaum. There was an official whose son was ill.
Well, in verse 48, Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders, that leads me to believe that he may have been something to do with a ruler, or like Pharisees kept asking for signs.
When we get to verse 48, we'll look at that in a little more detail.
Okay.
More likely, the point here, though, that's germane to the story anyway, is he's a father. He's a father of a sick child. Does that tell you anything about identity? Imagine yourself if your child was sick. And you were a nobleman. You had resources. Remember, like Jairus in Mark 5, he was a ruler of the synagogue. He had resources, right? And he's using his resources to save his son. And yet, nothing's happened. Yeah. This is a desperate man. By the way, the verse 48, he's speaking to the crowds. Who are the crowds that are gathered around him? They're Jews. He is one of that crowd, most likely himself a Jew. So, here's this nobleman who is desperate. Ron?
Verse 51 says he has servants, but he didn't send the servants. He went.
Yeah. That's what I would do as a dad. You know, if my child is hurt, I'm going to do everything in my power to mend them, heal them, get them the best medical care that I possibly can. I see that's what this man has done, and now he's down to, as you said, the last resort. This is it. You know, he is at the brink of death. Remember, that's what he tells him. Notice, he says, the official said to Jesus, I'm sorry, I've got ahead of myself there. When the man heard that Jesus had come to Judea to Galilee, from Judea to Galilee, he went to him, asking him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. He is knocking on death's doorstep, and he's expended all that he can. And you know, the fact that he's a nobleman, the fact that he has servants that are tending, shows that he's got some resource. And yet he is not able to save his child. It's something that we learn all too often in this life. You know, the Beatles said money can't buy you love, but we have found that money can't buy you health and life either, can it? Because we see even the richest, most powerful people in the world still die. So when you're desperate, you do desperate things. And for a Jew, most likely, even for a nobleman, to rush to the feet of a carpenter, an itinerant preacher, that's pretty desperate. Let's read a little further. It says that when he had heard that Jesus had come from Judah to Galilee, it says, the ESV says, he went to him. And that is true. The word went, to, and him are all found in the original. But the word went actually has the prepositional prefix in the beginning, apa or apo, which means away. He went away to him. What did he go away from? Yeah? His son. When your child is dying, you want to talk about desperation. He went away from his son to go to Jesus. I love that this man is doing all that he possibly can. So Capernaum to Cana is about a 20-mile ride by horse or I guess by flight if you could fly something, but they weren't flying back then, but about 20 miles away. But he went away from his son, and he gets to Jesus, and the ESV says at the end of verse 47, he asked him to come down and heal. I love the ESV, but so far tonight I've had a couple of hits against it, and I'm going to have another one here. That doesn't quite capture the urgency of the word of the original. The New King James uses the word implored, and you get that idea of begging. The NIV uses the word begged him. He begged him to come down to my house. There is an urgency in him, and that better captures the intent, I believe, this man. But not only that, the word that is used here is in the imperfect tense. Remember, when we talk about Greek tenses, it's not just a past, present, and future. They have a few extra tenses in there. One of them is what we call the imperfect tense. What that means is that the action of that verb has not been completed. And we usually say that is an ongoing action. In other words, this man came and he was begging him over and over and over and over. Please come down and heal my son. He's at the point of death. Surely if you do not come, my child will die. And so he's begging him over and over and over and over again. But the nobleman seems to be working under at least two false impressions. The first one is that Jesus needs to be near. He must be present in order to heal his son. Where this faith of the centurion was, I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. The idea of the nobleman was, you have to come in order to save my son. The other impression that he seems, or that he has, is that if the child dies, then it will be too late. What we as readers know is that the power of Jesus extends beyond the immediate location and beyond the immediate realm. Death is not the final step. Even if Jesus tarried, as he does, for example, with Lazarus, Jesus waits for days before reacting to the news that Lazarus was near death, so that he would die. And not only die, but be dead for a good while by the time Jesus gets there. Sometimes Jesus does it, he never quite does it the way we expect him to do it. But, in this case, he responds before the child dies. But he didn't have to, did he? Even death, it wouldn't be too late. Jesus' rebuke in verse 48. Jesus said unto him, unless you see the signs and wonders, you will not believe. And what's interesting is he speaks to him, or says to him, but when he says you, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. But he doesn't use the singular second person, you. He uses the second person plural, y'all. Unless y'all see signs and wonders, y'all will not believe. So he takes this rebuke, and I know there's some who try to soften the words here, that it's not really a rebuke, but it is a rebuke. It's in fact, the original is very emphatic. It was a rebuke of them, and he says, he's looking at him, and he says, you all are this way. This whole crowd is this way. Because in general, people tended to focus on the miracles, especially in Galilee. They wanted the signs. They wanted some sort of proof that these were the things that were going on. The general heart of the crowd of Jews toward Jesus is unbelief, but curiosity. We don't know if we want to believe in this man yet or not, but we're just curious enough to come out and see what he's going to do. What kind of interactions is he going to have with the Pharisees or the Sadducees? Or what's he going to do to this person that's a demon possessed? There's a curiosity that is drawing people out to see Jesus. But the nobleman doesn't have a luxury of a curiosity, does he? His child is dying. He's one of these that he needs Jesus. Now, John has already shown us that Jesus doesn't trust faith that is based solely upon miracles, right? John chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, many believed in him when they saw the signs that he was doing, but Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them. Jesus didn't trust the faith that was based solely upon miracles. Now, he came to invoke faith. In fact, the focus of this verse, and I would say the focus of this entire section, this entire paragraph, is that statement. John, it's like he underlines and bolds it in the original. He says, everyone look here, you will not believe. And that's important because John is trying to invoke faith through his entire gospel. That's the whole purpose of the gospel. And Jesus even emphasizes it in his statements. You will not believe. It's almost as if he's yelling that part out to them. The grammar emphasizes those words because it is all about faith. The miracles were a part of his ministry, which also included such things as his teaching, right? His compassion. I don't think you can talk about the ministry of Jesus without talking about his compassion and his miracles. They were all part of the package, the ministry of Jesus. And all of it was to spark faith, but people ignored Jesus' act of compassion. They often ignored the words of his teaching, focusing only on the miracles. And that's why they will not believe. John?
You know, it seems to me, though, that maybe Jesus isn't really so frustrated that people don't believe unless they see the miracles. Because even John the Baptist, you know, needed to have confirmation and so forth. And it seems to be the whole scenario is he does that so that you will believe and so forth. And then later on he says, you know, even though you didn't see, you believe. And so for us, we see through the scriptures that he did the miracles and so forth. And although we didn't see him, we have the scriptures and we believe. And so it just seems to me that Jesus is fully aware of human nature.
Yeah.
And you know, certainly, if somebody came today and said that they were Jesus returning, you know, people would want to see some proof.
Absolutely. People are generally more drawn to spectacle than the mundane. Look, if, you know, I don't know how many we got in here, maybe 30 in here tonight, maybe 35 or so. Teaching and studying the Word of God is mundane to a lot of people. But if we were down at the cemetery raising dead from the grave, do you think we would be able to keep the crowd limited to 30? People are drawn by spectacle. And it's a lament because, and Jesus knows that. But he's got to do the spectacle anyway because the spectacle is, in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, the first step in the first century. Not today, obviously. But in the first century, it was the first step of not just an introduction to Jesus, but an introduction to faith. To me, this is important because if faith is what Jesus is trying to build, notice how this man's faith grows. The man continues to beg. After Jesus gives this rebuke, the man continues to beg. He says, "Sir, come down before my child dies." And what's interesting is in verse 46 and 7, it says his son was ill. "Come down, my son is at the point of death." But now he changes. He changes to the word paidon, which is a term of endearment. My little child. He's tugging at the heartstrings of the compassionate master. My little child is at the brink of death. This is a man who had enough faith to go from Capernaum to Cana, 20 miles away, to meet this man that he's heard so much about. But we might call it a crisis faith. He was a man in a crisis, and so he has the kind of faith that will take him there. It's not the faith that will save him. It's not the kind of faith that will ultimately save him, but it's the kind of faith that at least opens the door to Jesus. We often today call it something like a foxhole faith. When we're faced with that moment of crisis, it's then that we sometimes turn, or people will often turn to God, at least a little bit, opening that door. Frank? Well, certainly there's an expectation that our faith evolves and is based, or is a deeper, more trusting faith in God. That's where God is trying to get this man, or where Jesus is trying to get this man to go. And ultimately, if we don't get to finish this class, he's going to get there. but we're not there yet. Jennifer.
I was just thinking about that, but the people forgot about what God had done in the Exodus. The people killed the prophets during the kingdoms. They still didn't believe Jesus. We look at the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and Abraham tells the rich man, even if I send them back, they still won't believe. They have the law and the prophets. And how many people today want to see miracles to prove it, and yet still won't believe?
And I think in every era that you're describing, the problem is that human beings are in love with this world. That's what it is. I mean, they forgot about God's miracles because, God's miracle happened 4 days ago. It just like, Frank and Janet Jackson said, what have you done for me lately, right? We need to see something else. And whenever the something else isn't forthcoming, then all of our focus then is drawn back to this world. My food, my water, my health, my children, my family, things like that. Read.
It seems to me like the kind of faith we need to have today is the kind of faith this guy had. This guy didn't see signs and wonders. He heard the word of Jesus and believed.
That's right. He heard, and that's exactly where we're going. His little crisis faith is now challenged to go further. Notice, the man is begging him, as he has been all along. In verse 50, Jesus said, "Go, your son will live." And what does it say? The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. Yeah, we don't have the proof. This man didn't have proof. He didn't see his child from 20 miles away stand up like everything's fine. He didn't see that. There's no evidence whatsoever that this man should believe. But his faith grows confident. And so he goes from this crisis faith to this confident faith where he learns God's will, or at least sees the power, and believes even without evidence, believing the word of Jesus. And this was really a test. Does God test us? Look, you can turn back to page 1 of your Bible, and that's where the testing begins. And God has always tested his people. Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. I want you to sacrifice him. Did God just need a show, an entertainment? Was he just watching a movie in the life of Abraham? No. This was a test. How did Abraham do? He passed. Not everyone does that. Well, in that instance, Abraham passed. So here we've got this picture of this man who believes right then. He passes the test in this moment. It's beautiful. So much so that what? He leaves. He stops badgering Jesus. Come down to my house. He accepts what Jesus said and he walks away. Now, as he's going down, his servants met him and told him that his son, the ESV, takes another hit here, was recovering. The word in the original is living. Your son is living. And that's significant because 3 times in this context, John mentions the son lives. Jesus said, your son lives. Now the servants tell him, your son is living. And then in the end, he says, you know when that happened? When he said, your son lives. 3 times, John repeats that phrase, the son lives, son lives, son lives. And it's right here. He's not just recovering, he's living. And the indication is that he's going about his normal, everyday walk of life. He's just like he was before he ever got sick. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him. Now notice his question. When it began. When he began. You see, he's expecting that there's going to be a recovery from this sickness. He believes Jesus, but he thinks it may take a few days for him to get back to normal. When did the process begin, he asks. They said, oh, well, it didn't begin yesterday, 7th hour. Boom, he's fine. Oh, well, that's when Jesus said, your son lives. And it was immediate. It was even more than he expected. And Jesus said to him, or he realized that was the father knew that was the hour when Jesus said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed. So now he's gone from this crisis faith to this confident faith to now he goes even more to this, let's see what I called it here, this confirmed faith. He has confirmation that his son is alive, his servants tell him. But Reed, I'm going to disagree with you for just a second here. You said this is the kind of faith we need. I think this is the kind of faith we need. What's the next phrase? After he says that he believed him. Him and what? His whole household. It rests on a contagious faith. A faith that was not kept to himself, but one that he shared with his entire household. It's an evangelistic zeal. It's part of John's message. We saw it with with Andrew and Philip in chapter 1. We see it here and we see it in other places. That our faith needs to be that kind of faith that grows to be contagious. That it's so infectious to those around us that we can't help but tell that our life is so infatuated with God that those around us cannot help but see the faith at work in us. And that's exactly who this man was. Now, in our final minute or two here, we have one problem that comes up, and that's this 7th hour. You start counting time in the ancient times. In the book of John, he uses a Jewish measuring system, and the 7th hour would be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which would give him plenty of time to travel the 20 miles back to Capernaum. But when does he meet his servants? The next day. Remember, they said it was yesterday at the 7th hour. And he knew yesterday at the 7th hour is when Jesus told me everything's going to be fine. Why does he tarry? Why does he wait to go? Well, some have said, well, John is measuring by Roman time. And Roman time, the 7th hour is 7 p.m., it's too dangerous to travel at night, so he stayed overnight in Cana and left the next morning. And that seems pretty simple. That's a good explanation, except John uses the Jewish measure of counting time all the time. But here's what I like. This man walks away confident, doesn't he? So confident that he can stay the night. He doesn't have to hurry back. Maybe his horse is tired from running 20 miles to meet Jesus before he left Cana, and he's going to let his horse rest. That's fine, because his son's alive, and he knows it. Maybe he's got other business to take care of in Cana. They don't travel to Cana all the time. Maybe he's got a cousin he wants to go see. That's fine, because his son's alive. His son lives. He doesn't have to worry about his child anymore. He is confident. And I think that points to that kind of faith. The kind of faith that is confident and is contagious to those around us. And so I do love that. I do love that just upon hearing the word of Jesus, the faith turned around into something bold and deep, something that we can latch onto for our own lives and see in ourselves. How has my faith grown? Am I still back on that crisis faith? Or have I gone to this challenged faith, this confident faith that God wants to see in me? Appreciate your attention. For next week, of course, will be our gospel meeting. The week after, the Wednesday after, we will be doing the Noblemen. No, I'm sorry, this was the Noblemen. We'll be doing the man at the pool of Bethesda. I know I announced that last week, but we'll really do it this time. The first few chapters of John 5.